Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. I'm excited to share a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing on perceptions of invasive species. And did the slide advance okay? Everything going all right? And
Looks
hopefully everybody can hear me.
it looks good.
Okay. So, just to give you an idea of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you a little bit about myself and expanding on positionality and kind of why I do the research that I do in the way that I do it. And then I'll spend a good chunk of this presentation talking about a study we did in Guåhan on the perceptions of invasive species by local residents. And you might hear me like flip back and forth between Guam and Guåhan. If you don't know, Guåhan is just the indigenous name for the island of Guam. And then, if you'll permit me, at the very end, I'd like to touch just a little bit on a really cool study that was conducted by some students that I mentored during an island ecology course that I helped to teach last summer. And it's still on the topic of perceptions of invasive species, but we were able to survey Micronesians from different islands that were participating in this course. So, to tell you about myself, I need to tell you a little bit about where I'm from. And I was privileged to grow up in the islands of Micronesia, which are very beautiful. And I had a very strong connection to the natural world. But from a very young age, I also realized that there were a lot of challenges and threats to this natural world. And so I knew that I wanted to do something involving conservation of nature. And so when I was growing up, I thought that maybe it's best if I become a biologist. And so I emulated scientists that I saw on TV or that I read about. Um, but these scientists tended to kind of go far away from home and make so-called discoveries, including my dear old dad. In case you're wondering, wait a minute, am I supposed to recognize the guy with the spear gun? That's my dad. I think he's on the call right now, and he is also a biologist, and I've long looked up to him in my career. So I went far away from home and I pursued my education. And along this time, as I was learning to become an ecologist, I realized that I had some really important lessons to learn from my mom as well, and from my fellow Micronesians. Micronesians have a really intimate knowledge of the natural world around them, and they've actually enacted conservation practices for thousands of years, doing things like traditional management of fisheries, and they continue to adapt today. Like this woman on the island of Pfeffin in Chuuk, who had learned to grow upland taro because she was anticipating the effects of sea level rise and saltwater intrusion into the more traditional lowland taro. So let's start with one corner of Micronesia that's very dear to my heart. This is Ritidian or Litektin on the island of Guåhan. And in my opinion, and I think by most conservation standards, this is some of the best forests on the island. And indeed, it is part of the National Wildlife Refuge, and it has threatened and endangered species there. But it's certainly not without human influence. There are also invasive species there. Um, there's evidence of human influence stretching back to almost 4,000 years ago. It's one of the oldest villages in Guåhan and in Greater Oceania, actually. Some of this land's been converted in the past to a coconut plantation. And today, it's also being under threat from recent military developments and the construction of a large live fire training range in the forest on the cliff line right above this area. So if we wanted to conserve this area, we need to think beyond just kind of the ecological processes that are going on. And so a lot of the research that I do and that I'm learning to do now involves not just the ecology of the non-human species, but the human dimensions and placing this into the larger geopolitical systems as well. And I'd love to tell you about some of my ecological work, but today I'm going to focus in on the human dimensions of this. And I'm able to do this because I work with social scientists like my co-author, Dara Wald, whose name you may have seen on the first slide. Um, and I'm still training in social science methods, um, and looking forward to partnering with people who study social science in order to ask these really important questions that are relevant to conservation. So let's go ahead and jump into the study on perceptions of invasive species in Guåhan. And I'll walk you through some of the background behind this, the methods, as well as the results and themes we came away with. So why do we even care about human perceptions? Although Americans in the US largely view science and scientists in a positive light, that story has been slowly changing over the years. And research out of the Pew Research Center that regularly surveys US adults found that people who perceive fewer Americans now say that science has a mostly positive effect on society. In fact, 8% in 2023 compared to 4% in 2016 say that science has a mostly negative effect on society. And confidence in scientists has been declining over the years. It's somewhat stabilized since last year, if you look at this right-hand panel. But that trend has been in the negative. And so this has also been kind of used to justify dismantling some of the important research programs that a lot of us participate in. And so I would argue that it is important, even if you do science that isn't related to social science, to understand somewhat about human perceptions of science. And I think we should understand how people perceive the species that we're trying to conserve or the species that we're trying to manage. There's a really wonderful paper by Estevez et al. That talks about invasive species management and why people might be concerned or opposed to different methods of management. Some of the reasons that they highlight include species can be useful or perceived as useful. Sometimes there are moralistic concerns with controlling species. If you think about lethal control of cats, sometimes the control can be viewed as risky, not just to the target species, but to the environment and the people where this control is taking place. The bottom photo is a photo of pesticides being applied to a waterway to get rid of this really invasive water weed in Florida. But of course, there are concerns because pesticides are being introduced to a waterway near human homes. And another thing that was really important that they pointed out was that a lot of these perceptions are nuanced. They vary by place and by culture. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the place and the culture that we're focused on today. So this is the Western Pacific, the Mariana Island chain. And we spoke with people mainly from the island of Guåhan, which is the southernmost island in this chain. It's also the largest and most populated of the Micronesian islands. And to give you some important context about Guåhan, I had mentioned before that it's one of the first islands in Oceania settled by people. It's also one of the oldest colonies. So in 1521, the island was quote unquote discovered by Magellan and claimed for Spain. Here's a depiction of Magellan discovering Lapu-Lapu in the Philippines. And so there were hundreds of years of Spanish rule that really impacted the people and the environment of the island. And during World War II, Guamanians also suffered through a really brutal occupation under the Japanese Empire. And it's important to note that this colonialism continues to today. We're still an unincorporated territory of the US, and we're a heavily militarized island as well. In fact, the US military owns almost 30% of the total land area of the island, and they're increasing their presence. I had mentioned earlier the construction of the live fire training range, as well as all these facilities to support relocation of Marines from Okinawa. So if you know just a few things about Guam or Guåhan, You probably know about how militarized the island is, and you probably have also heard of this really infamous invasive species that we have, the brown tree snake, which is responsible for the extinction or extirpation of all of our native forest birds. And these might be some of the most depressing bird count graphs you'll ever see. Um, but you'll see across multiple bird species, these are roadside counts done by the local DAWR Wildlife Agency. And these counts just started zeroing out as we approached the 1980s. And while you might know today that it's because of the snake, as this was happening, it was a mystery. People didn't know why our birds were disappearing. And it wasn't until a young PhD student, actually, by the name of Julie Savage, started investigating this question. And she looked into some more maybe intuitive culprits like disease and pesticides. But she also spoke with local people around the island. And she was encouraged by local people, especially chicken farmers, to really look into the snake. And I like to tell this story, not just because, yes, of course, it's important to understand people's perceptions so that we can avoid any sort of backlash in the work we're doing, but often our knowledge is really incomplete without those local perspectives. So once the connection was established between snakes and bird loss, it was really important to make sure that this didn't happen in other islands, and a lot of resources go into researching and controlling the snake. At every single port of exit in Guåhan, there are traps with live mice. They get checked every few days. There's also some efforts at landscape level control. And one of the most promising projects has been the aerial mouse drop, which maybe you have heard of. It involves taking an acetaminophen tablet, attaching it to a neonatal mouse, and then shooting it out the back of a helicopter so that it can hang up in the trees. And these acetaminophen tablets are lethal to snakes. And when they've tested this in limited areas, they found high success where populations of snakes were knocked down. But as you can see, a lot of resources are devoted to this one species in particular. However, there are multiple harmful invasive species in Guåhan. And so we were curious how people felt about them and how they perceived them. And so we started by asking some basic, pretty broad questions of people, just their opinions on environmental threats in general, which invasive species they were most concerned about, and then their opinions on management. And we did this by conducting small group discussions. All of our participants were adults and long-term residents of Guåhan, but they came from all walks of life and ranged in age from, college age to seniors at senior centers. And we ended up speaking with 22 groups and 73 people in total. And since not a lot of people had looked into this before, we used an approach called grounded theory, where we coded the transcripts and used the conversations themselves, the words that people told us, to come up with themes instead of really coming in with like a preconceived hypothesis about what we were expecting. And I'll go ahead and share some of those themes with you today. So the way I'm going to do this is for each theme, I'll share a direct quote from people that kind of exemplifies this theme. And that was, this theme was something that was common that we kept finding as we went through more and more discussions and conversations. And the first one dealt with newer invasive species being perceived as riskier. So I just told you all about the brown tree snake, but many more people spoke about the rhinoceros beetle, the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which is a newer invasive to the island. This is just the number of times each of these species was mentioned during our conversations. And of course, people mentioned a number of other species like pigs and invasive vines, little fire ants. And I think this particular quote sort of exemplifies this idea of this comparison. This participant said, at my house, all the coconut trees are destroyed, but of course, we grew up with the brown tree snake, so it's not so much an invasive species for us. These are some pictures of the damage that coconut rhinoceros beetles can do on the left, and a coconut rhinoceros beetle caught in a net on the right. And what we know from the risk perception literature is that this isn't that surprising. So things that are more dramatic can be perceived as scarier versus things that are more long-term threats. So the coconut rhinoceros beetle is newer. Its effects on coconut trees are very dramatic. Think about how people perceive, say, nuclear meltdown versus, effects from coal and gas and this progression of climate change. Things that are perceived as new or unfamiliar tend to be scarier than things that are familiar. And this, innate fear has been used to justify a lot of how we treat, migrants that are not like us. As well as people are concerned or fearful for threats that they perceive as affecting their lifestyle and their identity. Of course, coconut trees are really important in Guåhan as they are in other Pacific islands. And whereas with birds, it's a little bit less clear what the cultural importance of them are in Guåhan. Another theme that came up a lot was how effective or not effective management was. So a number of people shared about how their own management actions that they were undertaking were not effective, and they were frustrated with that. So this participant talked about how they went to the briefings about using this particular net that was being promoted to control rhino beetles. And I wrapped tech nets up to all the high leaves. They were talking about their property, and that didn't work. And other people expressed more general frustration about management of invasive species. And we're seeing more of these all over. So whatever they're doing is not working because it's spreading. It's getting worse. It's not getting better. People were also frustrated with response from management agencies. So several participants talked about a hotline that you could call, but either they didn't get an answer or they didn't get a response. And this one participant kind of summed it up. I'm sick about marketing, outreach, and educational efforts. There's effective ones and ineffective ones. And if I see another poster that just tells me to call a number, that won't do anything. And so as we were coding through this, we were worried about the risk of learned helplessness, which is a term that's been used to describe a failure at changing behaviors, or like not making strides if you're trying to lose weight or quit smoking. But it's also been applied to in environmental contexts, for example, to despair over climate change, not being able to do anything to change climate change. And I think it's important to point out that some of the management and the environmental changes that are happening in Guåhan are really out of the hands of the community members, because, as you know, we are an unincorporated territory and a very much militarized island. Another interesting theme was people talking about apathy and talking about apathy as an environmental threat. So this participant, people were just like popping off on this idea of apathy. I was trying to think of what makes me most just angry, and that's the apathy, I think. It's one of the things that really upsets me, that people really just don't care. And this perception of apathy extended not just to other members of the community, but to their leaders as well. A lot of leaders don't care, and the ones that do care don't have the political power to stay. A lot of people that are being elected are not environmentalists. They're business people. Business comes first. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to the last theme, and then I'll reflect on these last two together. So often in the same breath as people were complaining about the apathy of their peers, they were also self-reporting their own pro-environmental actions. So a lot of people talked about picking up trash, like this participant who said, we try to leave the beach a little bit cleaner than we found it. And of course, people talking about what they were doing to manage invasive species. I mentioned the Tekken nets earlier and calling the hotlines. And this person applies lethal control when they go out into their yard. I see African land snails, which I have no problem stepping on. The bufo toads, they're referring to the cane toads. In fact, I used to go out in my yard every night and kill at least 13 a night. And so there was this really interesting dissonance in how people judge themselves versus how they judged others. And this has been observed in a lot of, other behaviors documented with how we perceive other people's driving abilities versus ourselves, how often other people make hypocritical statements versus how often we ourselves make hypocritical statements. But I think the silver lining here is that we did have all these anecdotes of pro-environmental behavior, and maybe the people just need opportunities to be involved in organized pro-environmental behaviors so that they can see others participating. And so just some conclusions from this study. I think it's important to address this perceived apathy and inefficacy. I did want to point out that there was actually a lot of outreach success. So people knew the hotline to call, they knew which invasive species to be concerned about, and were actually turning to different promoted methods of control. And so if people are receiving these messages, we should also be sharing about our own management successes, right? And about good stories as well. And I personally do not think that the people of Guåhan have learned to be helpless. I think whenever there is an activity, citizens are eager to volunteer, and these are just a few photos of those examples. The top two photos are from an annual fanihi count. Fanihi is the local word for fruit bat. And these participants wake up at 3 a.m. and they submit their paperwork weeks in advance to be able to access the Air Force Base. And most of them don't see a fanihi, but they come back every year and are excited to participate. Another really awesome example is the group Friends of Islandano. Islandano is also known as Coco's Island, and this is a small island off the coast of Guam where we realized that brown tree snakes had established. And this is an important island for nesting seabirds. The local wildlife agency had also started introducing endangered cocoa birds, our flightless rail, which is the state bird of Guåhan. And so it was really concerning when we realized that there were snakes established on this island. But when we realized this, it was during the pandemic, and a lot of agencies were just kind of paralyzed and couldn't mount a response. And so volunteers did. When it first started up, people were paying for the gas for the boat rides to go out and start removing snakes. And now they've had a whole lot of success with these volunteer groups, as well as when the agencies did finally mount a response. All right, and so the last thing I want to talk about, I know that I was concentrating a lot on perceptions in Guam and Guåhan, but I wanted to tell you about a study that some students did in this island ecology course that I helped to lead last summer. I promise you'll like it. It's super cool. So one of the best things that I do is I help to organize this island ecology field course. We've had several iterations of it. We usually hold it in Guam and Saipan, but last year we were able to hold it with the help of Micronesian Conservation Trust and the island of Pohnpei. And student participants were actually nominated by the Micronesia Conservation Trust through their home islands and the agencies that they work with. So a lot of the students are, not just, college students, but they're agency professionals, people like forestry techs and outreach specialists. And so whenever we gather these students together, there's a whole lot of knowledge exchange that occurs. A lot of them have very awesome knowledge about the natural environments of their islands that they're able to exchange with other students. I know I always learn a lot from the students when I teach this course. But we wanted to equip them with being more comfortable with carrying out the scientific method. So in this short course, in just 3 weeks, they develop a hypothesis, they carry out all their field work, and they write it up, analyze the data, and present it. And when we were brainstorming with this particular group of students, some students were interested in, um, invasive trees and how they had spread on the island. But there were a couple students who kept asking, well, what makes something an invasive species, and why do we call it an invasive species? And so these two students that are pictured on the right hand picture with me, Annie Esau, she's from Koshrai. She works with the management agency there with invasive species. And Tracy Ardos, who works for the national government of the FSM in Pohnpei. We worked together to develop some surveys because we had this awesome opportunity with this group of students from across the Micronesian islands. And we interviewed them as well as the instructors and some agency folks in Pohnpei about invasive species and their perceptions. One of the really interesting things we found was that there are literal translational differences in the different languages. So these were the translations for invasive species that the participants relayed to us. And you can see that they vary in their literal English translation. They can be an animal from a foreign place, a bad plant, everything that's introduced. And I think this one from Chuk in particular, etieti, I'm Chukis and I hadn't heard this term before. It means to push out of the way, and it referred to invasive vines and how they push other plants out of the way. And then in true Palauan form, they have a very long and difficult to pronounce description for invasive species that I'm not going to attempt to say. And of course, the words we use are going to affect our perceptions of these things. Another couple interesting things that the students found were that some invasive species were useful or culturally important. And participants shared about these uses and those cultural values. And this was related a little bit to another theme concerning changing lifestyles and westernization. And there's actually a really good talk in this series in Pacific Risks. I think it was Dr. Kamela Mella and her colleagues about indigenous leadership in invasive species management. And they came away with some similar themes of how we have to kind of broaden our perspectives about invasive species, realizing that a lot of indigenous people utilize them and that some of them even have cultural value. So a couple of species kept coming up throughout these interviews. African tulip, which is an invasive tree, and Muremia peltata, which is an invasive vine. People from across different islands were very concerned about these species. And they're pretty interesting because, first of all, Muremia is actually it's actually native to these islands. And participants were telling us about traditional uses of it. In Pohnpei, it's used as a trellis to grow yam. It's also used as medicine. But it started behaving like an invasive. It really covers the landscape and smothers out other plants. And people talked about how as agroforests are being abandoned and these practices are diminishing, it kind of allows for this species to become more invasive. And similarly with the African tulip, it used to be used as firewood more often, but that use has declined with the increased use of more modern tools like kerosene and charcoal. And so people perceived this tree as being able to spread more easily because it wasn't being used for firewood. So in the future, I'd love to get some more translations from across the islands and to dig more deeply into some of the outreach materials on invasive species and to see what words and what translations are being used. I'm also really interested in resource use by Micronesian communities, both inside and out of Micronesia. So there are a lot of large migrant communities, like my cousins, in especially in the islands of Guam and Hawaii, from the freely associated states, and they're certainly interacting with their novel environments, are definitely harvesting things, and selecting different species. And I think it'd be really interesting to look into what species and what resources that they're using. So if anybody's interested in brainstorming with me and potentially starting this project, I'd really love to talk with you. All right, I think we got through that pretty quickly. So I'd just like to thank, everybody that volunteered to sit and talk with us. We learned a lot of really cool things, talking to people in Guam and in Pohnpei. Um, this research was really seed funded by a grant through Iowa State, where I did my PhD. And thank you to the various partners at University of Guam, Micronesia Conservation Trust, and different funding agencies that kept me employed as I went through this data and wrote it up. And thank you to all of you for listening to me today. Sana ma'asi, as we say in Guam, and gliso chapur. This QR code will just take you to a Google Drive folder that has the study that I think it's been shared in the chat, but it's also got a study from 2018 based on some of the Guam discussion group work that we did that deals more with trust and invasive species management. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gawel. Do you mind stopping your screen share so we can see everybody?
Sure. There we go.
All right. So we're going to move into questions and answers. Thank you so much for the presentation, and especially all of the the definitions and community perceptions. It's such an underexplored area, and I see the need for so much more of this type of work across the Pacific, but also elsewhere. So I am going to look in the chat and see if there are any questions. We've got some thank you and great presentation in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? And feel free to put them in the chat or turn your video on and ask them out loud.
I'll raise my physical hand.
Go ahead, Christy.
Thanks so much. Anne-Marie, that was great. Thank you so much for sharing. Quick question about, when you gathered, especially on your Guåhan work, when you gathered folks, what was the age range that you had there? And I'm wondering if you're able to get a similar take. I didn't see too many young faces in there, but I'm wondering if there is a difference. Thanks.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I will say that because we were protecting the identity of everybody that participated, I use like stock photos of like bingo because we did a lot of interviews at senior centers and things like that. So those weren't actual participants, but just kind of a representation of the types of folks we spoke with. And we were kind of opportunistic. So I spoke with a couple of different groups from the Guam Community College students. And so we had some younger folks, and then of course the older folks at the senior centers. But then a lot of kind of, we sort of snowball sampled where we let some people know who told other people who told other people. And so people who were close to my age range, people in their 30s and 40s, we got a wide range. And I didn't notice any like major differences as I was going through the conversations based on age. But I think it's definitely worth revisiting and taking a look to see if we can tease out some of that.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'll read the first one. You highlighted the sometimes disconnect between the military presence and exclusionary practices. how they have unilateral control over many areas that lead to degradation, but also some areas are pristine because of lack of access. Do you have any thoughts on how to better engage with the military on this?
I think that's a great question, and thanks for that, Laura. Um, I think that it's another, like, I think this study, a very important study similar to this, could be done focusing on the military populations in Guåhan. I think I think just from my personal experience growing up there, that, you see the organization itself as this sort of big, intimidating, threatening thing, and they own so much of the island. But individual service people and I know a lot of my colleagues are biologists who work for the Navy and for the Air Force. I think there's a lot of opportunity for connecting at that level, at more of the kind of local grassroots level, and coming to mutual understandings about that. Like, I don't have the best answer for that, but those are kind of my initial thoughts on that. It's a really good question.
All right, we've got a couple more questions that have come in the chat. What are your recommendations for combating apathy in regards to invasive species?
Yeah, well, I think there's a perception of apathy, but a lot of people, and I mean, there were people who were willing to talk to us about invasive species, so maybe there's a little bit of self-selection happening there. But like I said, I think a lot of the outreach that our local wildlife agency, Division of Aquatic and Wildlife Resources, has done has really gotten through to a wide audience. I think there's this kind of bigger philosophical question too of just, our status and self-determination and people feeling empowered to do things that they can see the effect of. And I think, a very small place to start with regards to invasive species would be having these more coordinated group efforts. I've gone out with the Friends of Island Dano out to Cocos and slash Dano Island. And it's a very like uplifting, even if we don't find a snake, like it's such a wonderful community. So I think promoting those connections within the community is a really good place to start with combating apathy.
I got another one. Do you plan to interview people in the CNMI regarding their perception of invasive species as well?
Yes, I would love to. And that's actually kind of some of our plans with my co-authors down the line. This has sort of been our dream to also do some work in the CNMI. And initially, we actually did do some interviews in Saipan. We had just 3 groups, though, in a very small group, very small numbers. And so we didn't end up coding and publishing on that. But some of the interesting, so there were a couple of interesting differences between the folks in Saipan and the folks in Guam. And one of the things we noticed, at least, this is a small sample size, so take this with a grain of salt. But that sense of apathy was not as prevalent when people were speaking in Saipan. We asked people what they did about invasive species and what they would do or like what would happen, for example, if the snake got to Saipan and became established, and people were like, "Oh, we would never let that happen," like we're going to go out and find it and do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. So it was very encouraging and very inspiring. And if Tyler wants to help us maybe organize some more work in the CNMI, we would love to do that.
Love to. Yeah, I was just thinking
Yes,
because like we're on such a the road. Oh, good, you saw that comment. Yeah, that was basically it. Because when we had the BTS sightings back in 2015, our phone was ringing off the hook with locals like, "Let us come help." So it's just a different, interesting the difference in the perception. Great talk.
Thank you.
Other questions? I did have a couple questions that I'll ask one of to give folks a chance to think if they have any others to ask. It really struck me when you talked about shifting practices, and I think it was agroforestry was the example, led to increased invasion. And that, I think that's such an interesting aspect of the social science part of invasive species. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Sure. And, this was just from this 3-week course, data that these students collected in Pohnpei. But from what I understand, using this species as an example, I think a study on Maremia in the islands is totally warranted, because it is a traditionally important plant. And it's also, many people who spoke to us said, well, it's not really introduced. It's been here since I remember my grandpa using it and him talking about his his parents using it. And, it's used as a medicine, but it's also, in Pohnpei in particular, yams are really important. They've got all sorts of varieties of yams. It's a very important traditional food. And to grow yam, you need to have these kind of structures for trellises, and the vines of the Maremia plant will often help them grow their yams. They'll put them so they can kind of crawl up breadfruit trees. And yeah, there's this perception that, and I saw it driving around these islands. You can even see it when you fly into the island of Buena in Chuuk. There's a vine that's covering all the forest areas, and it's this Maremia plant, which is actually native, but it's begun to act more like an invasive. And people really think that it's because of this lack of actually managing it for traditional uses.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I'm not seeing any other questions. Any from folks out there in the gallery? Got some mentions, such important work. Thank you for sharing. We would all love the help from Tyler. So please get in touch with Tyler.
Sure.
I can ask a quick question if we have time.
Please.
So you discussed different dynamics such as grounded theory for the interview style, and also the risks of learned helplessness. And I feel like on Oahu, we're directly witnessing that specifically with CRB and some of the heavily impacted communities. So from that perspective, in an area that's already lost 70% of its forest to CRB, I guess what positive outputs can we take from a community that has seen this happen and they're moving forward with that? And how can we apply that to what's currently happening in Hawaii before the release of biological control?
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I mean, I think
This may be an opinion. It's just something that came to mind because we get these questions. I'm sure a lot of people in this room all the time. What are you doing about the beetle? And
yeah, and I encourage you to stay positive and to bring people in. And I mean, it's something I've struggled with in the past, working for different management agencies and in doing my research. Having some, things in your back pocket, whether it's providing information or inviting them to a seminar, inviting them to a working group, just ways of, tangible ways that you can engage people. And I think, all of us, both researchers and agencies, need to work on providing more of these opportunities for people so that they feel like they can use their talents, get their hands dirty, whatever they want to do to just be involved and help.
yeah,
It goes a long way.
Public outreach goes a long way. I agree.
Yeah, and I think not just outreach, but actually, here is something you can do, or here's a tool that I can share with you. Yeah.
Another question just came in the chat. Did anyone among your participants mention or perceive drongos or sparrows as invasive?
So I don't think anybody mentioned sparrows, but we had one participant. Because I'm thinking back on that the graph I showed, there's at least one participant that mentioned drongos, which are really, aggressive, not native birds. But yeah, it wasn't something that came up often enough for us to really dive into. Thanks for the question, Kayla.
All right, I'll ask one more and then we'll see if anything else comes in. And then we've got a short survey to finish this off that Mason will put out there in a minute. And I was really intrigued by the idea that, especially for invasive species that have established for decades in a community, about how that species may be perceived differently over time and even be used. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how those in the invasive species community can like better incorporate that into their work, whether they should take that into consideration or there's a way they can, consider
Yeah,
that
I
better.
mean, yeah, I mean, I think, this is just my opinion, but of course, people's perceptions of any threat can change over time. And you have to consider that and adapt your outreach, even your management approaches. I mean, I think, I think maybe like an extreme example is uh, perceptions of cats and what to do about cats. And we all know that they're ecologically very damaging, but they also are very important to people, raise a lot of emotions. And this isn't necessarily about change over time. But, you know, a lot of our work it's not well funded. It's not, yeah, these are projects that we're just scraping by with, and the least we can do is have community support and participation, right? And so really working to understand those perspectives and not opposing or villainizing anybody that might, find some invasive species very useful or find it important in their lives. I think that's something that we kind of need to like train ourselves to do. It's more nuanced, right?
Looking for any other final thoughts or questions from anyone? Kawai?
Yes, aloha, Elliot. I have a comment, or I wanted to thank you, ma'am. That was a great presentation, and I really like your approach with how you're trying to harmonize this double-edged sword of, the old ancestral way of perceiving things and the new age stuff. And I mean, that's what it really comes down to, because we're always going to have something that's invasive. Um, and so, yeah, I think this approach you have is promising. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Appreciate that.